Lecture 8, Other Formal Elements. For this chapter, this lecture, this discussion, we're going to talk about texture, pattern, and then time and motion. Here again are the key terms we'll be discussing in Lecture 8, and I've divided them all here in no specific order, but nonetheless, this should serve as a skeleton for your note-taking as you prepare to study for your quiz and exam. If you're familiar with these terms after the lecture, then you'll be in good shape for the examinations. We're going to talk about texture and time and pattern, and then a lot of the sub areas that tie into those. Rather than go over all of these now, I'll go over these for the next 30-40 minutes as we get through this lecture. First, we're going to talk about texture, and here we see Michelangelo's sculpture, the Pietà, made in 1501. Texture is a word that describes a work of art's ability to call forth certain visual phenomena and certain tactile sensations and feelings. Texture makes you want to touch something. There's two kinds of texture. We have actual texture and visual texture. In sculpture, for the most part, you have actual texture because you can actually touch it. It's actually there. And I'll get more specific as we talk about them. Michelangelo's Pietà is carved out of one block of white Carrara marble, one block of stone. Marble is one of the most tactile of all artistic mediums, and here in Michelangelo's Pietà, we are compelled to reach out and touch Christ's dead body. And so strong is our conviction that the masterfully carved marble is really soft flesh. Carved marble's similarity to skin does not correspond to its actual texture. Michelangelo, in fact, was able to imply or create a visual texture through his sheer skill. This is a pretty profound work of art. I'll stop for a minute out of respect to this great work of art and just talk about it outside of the context of this chapter. This is Michelangelo's Pietà. It's a little over 6.5 feet tall. It's life-size. It's a very famous sculpture, and it's the image of the dead Christ and his mother, the Blessed Virgin. When Michelangelo was commissioned to make this piece, he was asked to make the most beautiful work of art that had ever been made. So here, beauty is really what the Pope called for when he commissioned this work of art. It's an extremely powerful piece. I would argue it's the most awesome sculpture ever made by a man, by a human. And let's talk about it specifically. What we have here is, whether you know and believe in the Catholic tradition or not, you have here a woman, a very, very beautiful woman, sitting, and on her lap, covering her draperies, you have a dead man. And that's, of course, Christ and the Virgin holding her up. And, what about that? Well, I think it's really, really simple to understand this work of art. This work of art explains how much a mother can love a child. And if by understanding how much a mother can love a child, in this case, unfortunately, a dead child, if we can understand how much a mother can love a dead child, or just forget the mother, just someone can love someone who's died, then we can begin to understand how much perhaps God loves us all. And that was the intention Michelangelo had when he made this piece. He was trying to express this really profound and sublime truth that human beings love one another and mourn each other's deaths. And he's presented that by having this beautiful earthbound woman. You can see that she kind of forms a triangle, and her enormous draperies kind of cling to the ground. And then sitting on her lap is this kind of child. Again, it's an adult Christ, but kind of like a child just nestled in her arms. And he's kind of already just beginning to float. You could see in his shoulder, he's just beginning to ascend to heaven. It's almost like he's weightless. He's not sitting on her with any kind of any heavy gravity, but rather his body is defying gravity, and he's just about beginning to elevate to heaven because, of course, he's the savior of mankind, and and Michelangelo is clearly expressing the role of Jesus. Um, Also, the wonderful phenomenon here is we have Christ at age 31 after he's been crucified, and we have Mary who looks like she's about 18, whereas of course she should be 50 if she's his mother. But Michelangelo's taken liberties here, and he's presenting the Virgin as a youthful, ageless personification of pure maternal beauty. Again, this is carved out of one gigantic monolithic block of marble, and Michelangelo has done just a masterful job. This is truly the kind of piece that when you see it, you are speechless. This is in St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, in Vatican City, when you walk in on the right, and it's just this most masterful work of art. And I think whether you're Catholic or not, and whether you believe that Jesus was the Savior or not, regardless of what your religious affiliation is, you can see this work of art and you can understand that it has to do with compassion and sorrow and loss and love. And it's really, really a moving work of art that helps me as an artist understand and motivated me to become an artist. When I saw things like this as a kid, I began to understand how important art was and how it can be such an essential and important part of our shared culture. It's a terrific piece, and whether again, of course, if you are a devotedly Catholic, then it becomes a very sacred thing for you to see, and its mythology and its narrative become even more important. But even if you didn't know about Catholicism or Jesus, I think you'd still understand the the compassion here between these two people, mother and child. Anyway, in this chapter, we're talking about texture right now, and marble is a cold stone, and if you tap on it with your hand, with your knuckles, you'll hurt your knuckles because it's a hard stone. Michelangelo has masterfully given us a kind of a variety of textures in this piece. We see soft flesh, we see sheer flowing draperies, etc., hair, everything, and it's just masterfully done. So we have a variety of textures here, both real and both actual and visual. Um, Now, one of the points of confusion could be in our discussion of texture is everything about this work of art has an actual texture because it's actually there. Nonetheless, Michelangelo is implying soft flesh, and he's doing that through his masterful skill. But the whole piece, of course, feels like marble because it is marble. Its actual texture is marble. Here's a painting by Frank Auerbach, and when you apply the paint to a canvas in such a heavy manner that it seems to have a body of its own, we call that impasto. When you put paint down with such a thick strokes and so much extra paint on the brush that you can see all the evidence of the marks, we call that impasto. That's when the brush strokes are so physical that they have a life of their own. And again, we see that in this painting called View from Primrose Hill. Impasto. Another sculpture. This is a relief sculpture, and by that I mean a relief sculpture usually sits on a wall and it has no back behind it. This is a relief sculpture which is made with bronze and then oil paint by an artist named Manuel Neri. And what Manuel Neri has done here is he's using the actual texture of the bronze in both the smooth, which implies texture of the skin, and the rough, which leaves that unfinished kind of jagged part on other parts of the figure. So here we have the smooth and the rough texture in the bronze, which give us a variety of actual textures. And then we have the bronze being painted, which adds this other subtle texture of the brushstroke, which in turn suggests two-dimensional painting. So it's kind of a sculpture and painting combined here. Interesting. So we just talked about actual textures. Now let's try to consider visual texture. Visual texture means if you closed your eyes and touched it, you wouldn't feel anything. Visual texture means it's not really there, it's only visually there. Now, in the prior works, the impasto painting and the Michelangelo marble carving and the Manuel Neri bronze sculpture, we had actual texture. And in actual texture, if you close your eyes, you do feel it. You feel a range of texture. In visual texture, if you close your eyes, you would just feel the smooth surface of the page. So, um, visual texture appears to be, but it is not. This work by Max Ernst, called Europe After the Rain, seems to possess all sorts of visual texture, but they are actually just flat paper that has been affected by a process that Max Ernst coined, and that process is called frottage. It comes from the French word frotter, which means to rub, and was invented by Max Ernst himself. The technique is that you lie a sheet of paper down over actual textures, and then you rub over them with a soft pencil, and this kind of lifts up the texture from the object beneath it. Perhaps when you were a child and you worked with a coloring book on your front steps of your porch, you picked up the brick pattern or the jaggedness of a cement porch. That's an example of how you make frottage. It's this transfer of texture as you move along. So again, this is frottage, that actual rubbing, and this specific technique that Max Ernst invented, where he's transferred the color, one texture onto the page from an actual piece of wood or piece of cork or piece of seashell or piece of coral onto the page. That's an example of um, a visual texture and this specific technique called frottage, which is a way of lifting the textures of actual things onto your page. But it's a visual texture nonetheless. The piece is called Europe After the Rain. It's made 1941-42, and it makes a direct reference to Europe After the Rain, and that rain is World War II. You have the tremendous destruction to the whole of Europe, and Max Ernst is a German artist who came to America right around then, and you're talking about he's using this idea, the rain, as a metaphor for the destruction from the air of fire bombs and whatnot. This is a photograph, and this is a photograph taken, an aerial photograph taken from an airplane or a helicopter, and this is a great example of visual texture. All photographs have visual texture. In other words, if you close your eyes and touch a photograph, you don't feel anything except for the plastic emulsion on the paper. You don't feel exactly what's going on. This painting is an aerial view of erosion and strip farms, and this is taken from very, very high in the air, and this is the landscape, and you could see where there's been planting and maybe a river coming through in the upper right-hand corner, and all those things look like you could touch them and you would feel different textures, but of course you wouldn't feel a different texture because the photograph is just a smooth plastic skin. So photographs, again, are a great example of visual texture, not actual. The plowed strips of land contrast dramatically with those that have not been planted, and the geometric texture of the farmed landscape serves as a contrast to the irregular valleys of the unfarmed and eroded landscape. These are all, again, examples of visual texture on that photographic skin. If you closed your eyes, you'd feel nothing. That's visual texture. After texture, we'll move to pattern. Pattern is any formal element that repeats itself in a composition. Line, shape, mass, color, texture. They create a pattern. This is an example of a page from the Lindisfarne Gospels from the year 700, and this was what we call an illumination. An illumination is an elaborately decorated handmade page from a drawing. Usually, before printmaking, books were all made by hand by cloistered monks in the West, and by before printmaking, every culture that had writing had their own ways of making handwritten books. In Europe, they call these illuminations, and usually they were handwritten pages for the where they would write the Gospels or the Bible, and it would take a monk um, years and years, maybe even his whole life, to complete one carefully made Gospel or Bible. This is simply the letter T, which would have been a flanking page, and then on the opposite page would have had more words. It wasn't a book where only one letter goes to a page, but sometimes there would be sometimes in these illuminations, which are again elaborately decorated handmade books. And looking at a page from one of these books, we see the simple design of the Celtic cross contrasted with interlacing fighting beasts that in the animal style, which was widely prevalent through much of Europe at this time. Anyway, this is an example again of an illumination, and there's a lot of pattern in there. Those Celtic crosses that you see in those yellow and reddish orange squares, those are all repeated patterns again and again. Because decorative patterns are often associated with beautifying utilitarian objects in the crafts, uh, in folk art, for example, we associate them often with women's work, and that's a term in quotation marks. Women's work. Women's work would include, traditionally quilt making, sewing, needlepoint, things that women would have a greater traditional role with. Um, for prejudicial reasons, this idea of women's work has not been considered to be so sophisticated by artists. Art historians, for the most part, up until this piece by Miriam Shapiro, but art historians looking back at art history didn't consider quilting or sewing or needlepoint to be a substantial or legitimate medium for art making. They kind of marginalized what we call women's work and didn't allow it to be considered along with oil painting and stone carving. They considered things like quilting and sewing to be lesser, and they marginalized them. However, this changed in the 1980s when Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago and a group of feminist artists started making art that really celebrated women's work and celebrated the value that women's work had in our culture. Miriam Shapiro has done a lot to legitimize pattern's importance in the arts. Pattern, again, was something that was already a large part of quilt making and needlepoint and textile work. A lot of the what we call utilitarian objects, and again, utilitarian objects mean that the object has a function. So the function of a quilt is to keep you warm on a cold night, right? It's a blanket. So it might be beautiful, it might have important aesthetic information on it, but it's also functional and it keeps you warm. It's a blanket. If a work of art has a function, we call it a utilitarian work of art. So utilitarian art has often had patterns on it because it was folk art, and patterns were put on it to make the work more pleasing to the eye, because if you're going to have a blanket to keep you warm, you might as well have a beautiful blanket. So patterns were put on them. Anyway, here we see Miriam Shapiro and a piece she made in the 80s, which is called Nightshade, and it's kind of a fan of sorts. Anyway, a fan would be the kind of image that a woman might bring out to the theater to keep herself from perspiring. So it's again a subject that would be more associated with the feminine. Anyway, Miriam Shapiro, the artist here, coined a term called femage, and that is a kind of art that combines the words homage and feminism together. So it's a homage to the feminine, and she was trying to quote explore a part of my life which I had always dismissed: my homemaking and my nesting. So again, those qualities of women's work, those activities that were involved in women's work, were kind of marginalized and excluded from what was called legitimate art making at the time. But then people like Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago and other feminist artists came in there and they coined this term femage, and they started making art that really embraced this tradition that had been being passed down from mother to daughter, from grandmother to mother to daughter to granddaughter, and they elevated it or reminded everybody that it already deserved to be elevated to status of high art and legitimate art. And again, anyway, we call this femage, this category, and you see it here. Now let's talk about time and motion, and this is exciting stuff as well. Anyone who's ever stared at a piece of wallpaper knows how the eye moves to follow, one image on the wallpaper pattern to another. Um, there's a distinction between what we call the plastic arts, and not like Tupperware plastic or plastic bag plastic. but because the word plastic is a very, very old word and has to do with something else. Painting and sculpture are considered plastic arts, and the written arts like music and literature are known as the temporal arts. And I'll explain the difference. Again, plastic arts are things you could shape and change. Um, so let's compare two things. Let's talk about the spatial arts and the temporal arts. For the sake of our discussion, the spatial arts are painting and sculpture and drawing and photography. They're the spatial arts. In that, when you see them all at once. It doesn't require any time to see them. When you see a spatial art object, you see it, and there it is. You see it all at once. When you see a painting, you see it all at once. Those are considered spatial arts because you see them in space all at once. Temporal arts, and the word temporal means time, temporal arts are works that require time for you to see them. A temporal art has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You can't watch a movie all at once. You have to sit through the beginning, the middle, and the end. You can't read a book all at once. You have to start at the beginning and work your way to the end. You can't hear a piece of music all at once. You have to start at the beginning and work your way through it to get to the end. So music and literature and film are considered spatial media, spatial works of art. Painting and sculpture are primarily considered, I'm sorry, reverse that. Temporal arts means time. So again, literature, books, movies, cinema, and music are temporal. They require time to have a beginning, middle, and an end. That's the temporal time. Painting and sculpture are traditionally spatial arts in that you see them all at once, and that's the greater understanding. However, these temporal arts, um, this idea of the temporal, I'm sorry, the idea of the temporal, the idea of time, uh, tries to be expressed by artists in their plastic arts, in their frozen events, which can never really encapsulate time, like this stone carved sculpture by Bernini. uh, Bernini is still trying to express the temporal. So, although temporal is a term that's truly reserved for music and literature and film, and that has to move through time with a beginning, a middle, and an end, um, artists who make painting and sculpture are also trying to kind of, although they're working spatially and you see it all at once, they're still trying to work beyond that and to create something that implies the temporal. And we'll talk about that now. So here's Bernini's David. We saw Michelangelo's David in the first couple of lectures. Here in Bernini's David, we have a whole different pose. In Michelangelo's David, it was the large, imposing figure standing in contrapposto with the sling over his shoulder. Apparently, he'd already thrown the rock at David, and he was kind of taking his status as the soon-to-be kind of King David. Here we see a very different pose. In Bernini's David, um, we see the statue with eyes keenly focused and muscles clenching as he's just about to launch the stone at the Goliath. So he's taken his armor off to be more agile and flexible, and now he's about to shoot the stone at the Goliath, which we know he will succeed at, and then he'll go cut his head off and win the day. But again, in the discussion we're having now about the spatial versus temporal, although sculpture is a spatial material and you can see it all at once, Bernini has set up kind of a beginning, a middle, and an end through capturing this precise frozen moment in the middle of this famous Old Testament narrative. And that sets up a whole situation where we know he's about to throw the stone, so we know that something will be happening after this. He has the armor at his feet, so we know the story, so we know he's taken the armor off. And now he's, again, staring off into the distance, getting his aim ready to get his one shot, this one rock he gets to shoot at this enormous warrior who he will hopefully succeed in slaying. So again, an example of how even though sculpture is often considered a spatial medium and you see it all at once, he still implies the temporal. Bernini designs the sculpture and the composition of the sculpture by implying this narrative. In the meeting of St. Anthony and St. Paul, which is a 15th century painting, we also have, again, kind of a redefinition. Yes, we see it all at once, and yes, this is a painting, a spatial work of art, but it implies the temporal in some other ways. One way it implies the temporal in this case is that we see St. Anthony depicted in three different points on his travels on this road, his winding road. So again, St. Anthony's going about his journey. He meets St. Paul. He meets some kind of mythological figure in the middle there. So we get the feeling, although this painting is, again, spatial, we see it all at once, through compositional devices and through change in scale and through repetition of the figure, we begin to understand that St. Anthony went on a journey and certain things happen. So, again, this is a way that the traditional spatial painting can become a more temporal medium with some of these devices. Claude Monet, he painted those grain stacks we were looking at, and he was doing his plein air painting, and he was doing his um, exact notations of how the colors looked at that exact time of day in the previous works. In this piece of art, this is called the Water Lilies, and we're going to see two very, very similar versions, or two panels from a very, very large painting. Um, it's unfortunate that in this current edition of your book, you don't have an overview of this work of art. But there, in the earlier edition of this textbook, there was a black and white photograph that showed you the room that these water lilies all sat in. Um, there were 8 or 10 sections of these enormous painting that surrounded all the walls of an oval-shaped room, so that you could never escape the painting. And like a piece of music, you just kind of move your head, turn your body, and move around looking at the painting. And the painting was everywhere, and it was afocal in that there was no real focal point or central subject in the painting. So, like a piece of orchestral music, you just looked at it all and kept looking and searching and moving through the painting, seeing some lily pads, seeing perhaps a couple of little fish swim by. But it never really started nor ended, and it became this kind of open, cyclical kind of situation where you just kind of entered it, and then you went on this journey, and then it never ended. Um, so again, I'll show the next image, which is very similar to this. Again, a near identical image, but this kind of overall field of Monet painting the atmosphere of these ponds at the Giverny, where he lived towards the end of his life. Um, to appreciate large-scale works of art, it may be necessary to move around them and to view them from all sides, to view them over time. So again, Monet's famous paintings at his ponds in Giverny are so large that they fully encircle two oval gallery rooms at the Musée des Orangeries in Paris. And this causes viewers to move about in order to fully see them. Again, you have to fully move your body. So according to Monet's friend, George Clemenceau, the painting serves as an example of Brownian motion, which stipulates that small solid particles suspended in a fluid will be influenced by the water molecules that surround it and driven randomly throughout the solution. So in the oval rooms of the museum, the viewer eye is driven randomly through the space of the huge work of art. Again, I'll stress repeatedly, painting is a spatial medium, but here's three examples of a sculpture and two paintings of how artists have kind of tried to twist that and make them more temporal. He's tried to imply time by, again, making an installation and filling an entire work of art. An entire room with a work of art that never starts and never ends, so it just kind of keeps cycling through. Here's Bridget Riley's painting, um, and it's titled Drift Number Two, and it's made in 1966. Now, it might look. This is an example of op art, OP, not pop art, not POP, but OP, op art. Op art means optical art. It means a kind of art that's concerned with optics, your eyes, what you see. Um, it's made in 1966, and probably 40 years later, when we all look at it, it seems a little dated. This was made before computers and before computer printers, uh, and it was made by hand by a woman named Bridget Riley, who painted these lines very, very carefully to create this kind of sense of wavy movement. And if you stare at this painting for just 5 or 10 seconds, you start to get this sense of movement and waviness as the painting seems like it's just flowing before your eyes. Um, that's a pretty big deal. It's what optical art is all about. Op art is always about this kind of optical phenomenon. The painting is obviously not really moving. It's just this kind of confusing perception we all get when we look at it. Anyway, another way that you can embrace the idea of time in your work is if it actually moves or if it implies movement. This piece has implied movement through this complicated optics. 1966, before computers, Bridget Riley was really a pioneer, making this painting, by hand with a paintbrush, and presenting it to get to this kind of phenomenon that happened beyond the work of art. Again, although paintings happen all at once, here we're seeing the spatial meaning of painting being kind of elevated to the point of temporal. This is an action shot. This is not a work of art, but rather this is a photograph of a famous American painter named Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock was um, was labeled Jack the Dripper when he was featured on the cover of Life magazine in the late 1940s. A pun on Jack the Ripper, the famous London murderer. Jack the Dripper was no longer painting with a paintbrush on canvas, but rather he was flicking and throwing paint on canvas in this very active gesture. Um, Jackson Pollock is a member of a movement we call abstract expressionists, and these are the artists who totally got away from imagery and totally got away from abstraction and moved to the point of non-objective painting. They made works of art that were just about the paint that they were manipulating and throwing on the canvas. Jackson Pollock went to art school, and he was a pretty accomplished painter, and he could make things that looked representational. He had skill in that regard, but he wanted to push art beyond that meaning, beyond those traditional confined boundaries, and he kind of set up to do this kind of visual jazz, this kind of art that was made no reference to the outside world, just made a reference to itself, and he started throwing the paint around on the canvas. He took the paintings off the wall, off the easel, put them on the floor, and began to work all around them. The work has a kind of a fantastic sense. Some people are critical of it because they feel like they could do it themselves, and I'm not sure if that's a good criticism because you're certainly welcome to do it if you like. I've tried over the years to make some non-objective paintings like this when I was in art school years ago, and they're very difficult to do to the level of overall coherence and overall quality that Jackson Pollock made. But nonetheless, he was exploring what art could be a long time ago, and he did these paintings. We talk about them now in 2007 in this chapter 2008. I'm sorry, 2008. 58 years after the fact, but they were pretty radical 58 years ago when Pollock was doing all this. Now, when you go to Macy's or Walmart and you buy a bed sheet or some curtains for your window, it might have some splattered paint pattern woven into the design of the tapestry, textile design. And certainly none of that would have been possible if Jackson Pollock didn't invent this style 50 years ago. My point being that although these artistic styles seem reactionary and revolutionary and controversial when they're made, if you give it enough time, 30, 40, 50 years later, they get absorbed by designers and absorbed by the public, and now we don't mind having bed sheets with splattered patterns on them. Again, this is a picture of Jackson Pollock in action doing the work, and the reason why this slide appears in our section on time is because there's a sense of process. When you see Jackson Pollock make the work, you understand the process. But then when you see the work later on without Jackson Pollock in action, you still recall the process. My point being that these paintings reveal the kind of time it took to throw the paint around on them. You almost feel each slashing stroke. Here's a shot from a famous film that Hans Namath made a film, and he took a piece of plate glass with the camera beneath it, and he kind of filmed Jackson Pollock painting right on the glass. So you're getting kind of a worm's eye view from the bottom up, looking at Jackson Pollock as he threw the paint on the canvas and dripped the paint and made this non-objective kind of musically abstract image happen. It demonstrates again um, this idea of the temporal. Although I mean the performance, the activity of Jackson Pollock making the painting is temporal. When he was finished, it becomes a spatial painting. Here's a quote that Jackson Pollock said about painting on the floor. Because again, he took his paintings off the canvas, off the easel, off the wall, and put them on the floor to paint them. Quote, "On the floor, I am more at ease. I feel nearer, more a part of the painting, since this way I can walk around it, work from the four sides, and literally be in the painting." So again, pretty exciting that 50 years ago, Jackson Pollock was, redefining painting in this exciting way. I think the next slide shows us the finished work of art. Yeah, here's the finished work of art that Pollock made with that camera beneath him. And again, it's non-objective. You might be cynical and you might say, "Oh, my 5-year-old nephew could make that," and maybe you'd be correct. Although I don't think there's any reason to be that cynical about it. You could just kind of be open and understand that this is just an exciting way of redefining what painting can be and making marks in space. So again, this is Jackson Pollock, a painter who makes spatial paintings, of course, because paintings don't really move. But this one in particular seems to imply the time it took to make it. You can see the paint kind of, you can still feel the movement of the paint being thrown about and splashed about to make this kind of non-objective situation happen. It's a work by Ronnie Horn, a contemporary photographer. It consists of 96 photographs, each installed on two walls opposite one another. So we can't see the work at the same time. We're looking at the left wall, so then behind us there would be another wall with another set of images. And what Ronnie Horn has done is she's been photographing her niece. I think her name is Georgia. She's been photographing her niece over a period of 4 years. And she photographs the every couple of weeks or months, she photographed her niece a second or two apart, and then she comes back 4 weeks later and photographs her again and takes two more pictures, and then comes back again and takes two more pictures. So what you're seeing is one set of images. On the opposite wall would have been another set of images taken just a second behind each of these pictures. And it's kind of this idea of the work looking at itself. And I think one of the realities, or one of the expressive ideas that Ronnie Horn is trying to express in this photograph, again, is about time and motion. She's trying to have us consider, first of all, the span of the 4 years of this young woman, young woman becoming a woman. This kind of coming of age of. There's a quote here where Ronnie Horn says, "I really just recorded her in action, a girl becoming a woman, trying on identities and exploring her own persona and who she would be as she grew up." But again, Ronnie Horn photographed her niece in a series of photographic pairs, each taken about 2 or 3 seconds apart, with longer breaks in between the pairs, and then presents them as this record. So again, although photography is not a temporal medium, it's a spatial medium. When it's presented this way, we can't help but see the girl growing up from upper left-hand corner to lower right-hand corner, because it took 4 years, and she got 4 years older, and she changed and whatnot. So again, an example again of how artists are always trying to blur the boundaries. So photography and sculpture and painting are spatial mediums. They just stay there. They're static. But the artist here, in each case, has been trying to extend that definition to include the temporal, include time. We have two images, and these are probably the most misleading images in the chapter, because this is a still from a 5-minute video loop. So it doesn't have much meaning to us because we only see a frozen moment of it. This is an example of the temporal medium of video. But this couple that makes this work, Teresa Hubbard and Alexander Birchler, interesting. They make what they call these long photographs, even though they're in fact they're not really photographs at all. They're cinema, they're video. This is a 5-minute video loop that they call a long photograph. This is just a still from it. I'll show you the next image. In this image, we see how the work is installed in an art museum or art gallery. You walk into a room, and then there's this kind of continuous 5-minute loop where at whatever level you enter the room, this dark room, you'll see some part of the film, and then it will go on seamlessly until it begins again. And in fact, the way this couple makes their art in these 5-minute loops is they have a very long, slow pan where the camera will be on a dolly and it will slowly track through a situation, kind of like a series of photographs, and just slowly kind of go in and catch an activity and then move into the next room and then pan to the following room, and then it will go all the way back around until it comes back to where it began, and that's where the film loops. So it's kind of like this voyeuristic kind of moment where the camera is just kind of passing through some activities happening. But this is an example of temporal art, um, but it still plays with the idea of this. They call it the long photograph because literally they're expanding the photograph into this well, truly temporal medium, film. Our final slide today, our final two slides today, are by an American video artist named Bill Viola, and it's called "The Room for Saint John of the Cross." And I'll describe the piece, and then we'll talk about it. This is another video installation. So you enter a room here, and in this room, this larger room, in this room, there's a large movie projected on the back wall of a mountain, a couple of mountains during a storm, and there's sound in the room, and it sounds like the wind's blowing, and the mountains are there, and there's kind of jagged handheld camera work, and the wind's howling, and you hear the wind blowing, and you feel maybe it's raining out and it's real stormy, and you see these kind of aggressive mountains. And that's one part of this installation. The other part of the installation is this kind of smaller inner room, this like a cube, which you see in front of you. And inside that cube, one person at a time can stick their head in, and they see on a little table inside this room, they see a pitcher of water, a glass of water, and a very small television that is playing the video footage of the very same mountain that we saw outside the room in this windy, loud, handheld, turbulent storm. But inside, it's that same mountain on a peaceful day, and you hear birds chirping, and it's sunny out, and everything's just fine. And the only thing you hear inside is you hear the sound of this poet, the poems of St. John being read, and they're very low in whisper voice here. You have to strain to hear them. And there's a tape recording playing of St. John reading his poems, and they're about nature and about salvation. And then you pull your head out of this room because you've been hunched in there, kind of eavesdropping, and then you're back to this stormy, turbulent sky. So here's the detail. Here's the detail of that sunny day, sunny summer day for that same mountain range, and then a nice clear glass of water on this little table with pitcher. And then while you're popping your head in this room, you're hearing the kind of reassuring meditative poems by this important poet named St. John. And then when you again pull your head out, you get the contrast of the stormy day and the kind of the danger and the vulnerability of being alone on the mountain. So again, we have a comparison of how this is an example of a video installation, and this wonderful comparison about the wild and the dangerous and the open, and then this kind of nurturing and sheltered kind of comparison. This is an example of a video installation in that, for the most part, a video installation is something you could not watch on television. You would have needed that special room made by the artist. So this concludes Chapter 8, Other Formal Elements. I think we've talked about texture, pattern, and time pretty thoroughly. I'm looking at our little study guide here and making sure that we've covered all the terms. The term kinetic art wasn't covered. Kinetic art is art capable of actual movement, like the Alexander Calder mobile we saw in some of the earlier chapters. A work of art that actually moves, not implied, but actually moves, is called kinetic. Otherwise, I think we covered everything on the list. Very good. Okay, this concludes Chapter 8.